Well then today we're going to start talking about rationalism. We've already introduced the Platonic tradition. We've seen Descartes' particular twist on the Platonic tradition. Now I want to show you what happens to it after Descartes. Because Descartes' version is something that does lead to a certain school of philosophy that lasts for a while, the Cartesian school, but most people aren't really convinced by his argument that we can go from the I think and the I am to the knowledge of the external world. We haven't really discussed the details of the argument. That's coming up later this week, but I'll give you a quick preview. The basic idea is that I can trust my clear and distinct perceptions. I clearly and distinctly perceive that I have an idea of God. Where could that idea of God come from? I don't know, must be God. So there is a God. And what is God like? God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Would God give me senses that systematically deceive me? No. No good God would do that. So I can trust my senses. Now, you might think, I don't know if that argument makes much sense. Most philosophers have looked at that argument and have described it as something like a Cartesian circle. And we'll look at the details later. But it might seem like, yeah, wait, that's not the way to do this. So let's take a look at some alternative ways in which rationalists have tried to justify a position in some ways like that of Plato or Descartes, but put it on a foundation that doesn't sort of try to get from the I think and I am to God is, and God thinks and God is good, and therefore I can actually sense the external world. Well, how would this go? Let's start with the distinction between rationalism and empiricism. We've talked about this several times, but I want to remind you because it will clarify the issue that's really at stake here. An empiricist says that all of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. I have lots of knowledge of the world, says the empiricist, typically, and that knowledge comes to me through the senses. Either my external senses, like vision, hearing, and so on, or my internal sense, my internal awareness of my own states of mind. All knowledge ultimately rests on that sort of foundation, at least if it's knowledge of the world. Typically people exempt things like trifling propositions, to use John Locke's term, things like a soul is a soul. The rationalist says that's not true. The rationalist says that some of our knowledge of the world comes independently of experience. Now, it might be triggered by experience. It might be the sort of thing that arises when we have certain kinds of experiences, but it's actually inborn in us. It's there already. It's not coming to us from the world. It's something that at most is just triggered by something we see in the world, like something that's already there deep in the mind, and we're not thinking about it, not aware of it, and suddenly something happens that reminds us of that. And so the rationalist says some of our knowledge of the world is independent of experience. It's already there. It's innate. It's inborn. We come equipped with it already. Now, as we've seen, there are two versions of both rationalism and empiricism. There are two general issues we have to focus on. One issue is the question of our concepts, of ideas. Where are our concepts coming from? The concept empiricist says they all come from experience. I know something about chairs, and I have the concept of a chair by virtue of experiencing chairs. I sit in them, I lift them over my head and do chair presses. I do whatever. I encounter them in experience, and I know something about chairs, but forget the knowledge for a moment. I have the concept of a chair because I experience chairs. All of my concepts come to me from experience, or at least all the elements. Maybe I can take those elements and combine them in ways to form more complex ideas that I don't directly experience, but all of the raw materials come from experience. The judgment empiricist says all of my knowledge of the world comes from experience. That's our official definition of empiricism in general. And so the judgment empiricist focuses on knowledge, propositions, as opposed to the building blocks of propositions, which are the concepts. Well, that distinction between two issues here, the concepts or ideas, and then the judgments or propositions that we form out of them, that's a distinction introduced into this discussion by Avicenna, who distinguishes the knowledge of our concepts from knowledge of the things in the world that uses those concepts. And rationalists and empiricists can disagree about both. So we're going to have to keep that distinction in mind. Well, if we think about concepts or ideas, then what is the fundamental rationalist thesis? It is that there are innate ideas. There are innate concepts. That is to say, concepts we have that we can have independently of experience, that aren't just coming to us from experience, but are built into the mind. One way of looking at this is Philo's, God has stamped our minds with the forms, but another way of looking at it is to say we've evolved in such a way that our brains have certain innate capacities, they have certain innate abilities that apply directly to the world. So, from that point of view, you could say we are born with these cognitive abilities. We are born already capable of processing a certain amount of information from the world, and not only in the sense of receiving things and then combining and separating, which the empiricists would agree with, but that we have certain concepts really built into our minds from the beginning, from birth. So, Leibniz puts it this way: can it be denied, he says, that there is much that is innate in our mind, since we are, so to speak, innate to ourselves? And since in ourselves there are being, unity, substance, duration, change, activity, perception, pleasure, and 1,000 other objects of our intellectual ideas. Yeah?
So how would a concept rationalist look at a chair? How would they say that they know about a chair?
Okay, good. So think about something like a chair. Take this chair, and let's examine our concept of a chair. Is it innate? Do you think babies are born already with the idea of a chair? No. Okay? But so lots of concepts, rationalists will agree, are coming from experience. We don't come already biologically built in with the concept of a chair, or an Apple Watch, or a cell phone, or a baseball cap, or any of this sort of thing. However, there are certain concepts, the rationalist says, that we are built in. So, for example, we look at this and we see it as one object. Do we get the idea of one, of unity, from experience? The rationalist says no. I think actually we come equipped, already dividing the world up into objects. And so we come equipped with the idea of unity, of substance, that is to say of an object, of a thing. That's something that we use in processing experience. We take our experience and we divide it up into this, what? This idea that the world already consists of things. I look at a room like this, for example, and right away my mind chops it up into chairs and people. And then if I look more closely, into hats and shirts and glasses and notebooks and pens and all of those other things we take to be objects. Is that something I learned to do through experience? Do babies initially look at the world and just think, wow, it's just this swirling mass of, it's like an abstract painting, you know, and they gradually realize, oh, it's not just an abstract painting. There are objects. That's the empiricist story, and that's a plausible story. Psychologists still debate whether babies come with certain cognitive abilities already built in. So this is still a live issue in the empirical sciences. But the rationalist says there are certain things, like the concept of an object, like the concept of unity, that are already there as part of the mind's toolkit. The mind has the ability already, and not only the ability, actually the tendency to divide things up into objects. The same thing is true of duration and change. Do we simply learn that things change from the world, or are we already coming with the idea of recognizing when things are the same and when they change? What about causation? Is causation something we learn from the world, that certain things cause other things? Or are we already built to recognize causal relationships? Now this is one of the places where triggering actually makes a big difference. And here I don't mean triggering in the sense of making people upset. Oh, you talked about change. Oh, it's babies. It was really horrible. I mean this kind of thing. Actually, my daughter took part of these experiments at our children's research lab here. And they're very funny. They have the parent come in and hold the child. And the baby looks at this movie. And I got to see it independently. Though when the baby is looking at it, the parent is blindfolded, so their reactions don't influence the child. But anyway, here's what happens. You see this little movie. It's a little scene, and there's a screen. And you see a choo-choo train come down on this track. Then it disappears behind the screen. Then it comes out on the other side. Okay, well, it's not an exciting movie, these babies watch. But, you know, at first, like, choo-choo train. Okay, that's cool. Disappears. What am I? Choo-choo train. And then they contrast this. The train comes down, it goes behind the screen, and then it comes out the other side, a rubber ducky. Or it comes down, and it emerges on the other side, a teddy bear. Now, up until children are somewhere between 6 and 9 months old, it's all the same to them. It's all just like, huh, train, bear, train, ducky. I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? And the first few times they see this, you know, okay, it's interesting. Then it's going to train again, ducky again. They get bored. And so all of this can be measured and quantified. Now, what happens between 6 and 9 months of age? The child all of a sudden starts thinking in terms of continuous objects, starts thinking in terms of causal relationships and substance, and has this notion that things are supposed to remain the same in general. So, at that point, you show the child the train, emerging as a train. Okay, interesting at first, then boring. Then its train emerges as rubber ducky. The child suddenly looks up. What? Train turned into a duck? Okay, train turns into a bear, duck turns into a bear. Oh! Then the child all of a sudden. But before that, right, you change it in this way, and the kid's just again like, one thing after another thing. In fact, there's a quotation I'm fond of. Life is just one damn thing after another. And it's as if the baby thinks, yeah, life is just one damn thing after another. Trains, babies, duckies, mama, whatever. It's just like this swirling mass of stuff. And then somewhere between 6 and 9 months, the child starts thinking in terms of objects and continuity and duration and causal relationships and so on. Now, the empiricist says the child learns that the world has patterns to it and figures out these things and forms the concepts of a thing, of unity, of causation, and so on the basis of experience. Instead, the rationalist story is the child's brain already comes equipped with those abilities. It's just that it takes a certain amount of experience to trigger them, to bring them into operation. The child has to see enough of this to realize, oh, those concepts I already have apply to this and make sense of it. And as I say, it's still a live debate in psychology. It's not as if that's clearly settled. Here is the way Leibniz continues this argument. He says, as these objects are immediate objects of our understanding and always present, though they can't always be consciously thought about or perceived because of our abstractions and wants, why should it be surprising when we say that these ideas, along with everything that depends on them, are innate in us? So he says they're always there. We're always aware of the world as consisting of objects, of some things remaining the same while other things change. We're always aware of a kind of possibility of unity and diversity, the possibility of similarity or dissimilarity, and so on. And so our minds already have these things, even if we don't attend to them. Well, this does make it possible for us to know something independently about the world. And when I say about the world, I mean to exclude what Locke would call trifling propositions and what Kant would call analytic judgments. Here, just as a reminder, Immanuel Kant said that a judgment should count as analytic if you can know whether it's true or false just on the basis of the meanings of the terms. So Locke's example, a soul, is one like that. You don't have to know what a soul is. Just by knowing what is means you can really know that a soul is a soul. And another example, bachelors are unmarried. If you know what a bachelor is, if you know, that is to say, what the word means, you know that's true. Bachelors are simply unmarried men. But a synthetic proposition is one where Kant says the predicate is not contained in the subject. You cannot figure out whether it's true or false just by knowing the meanings of the words. And so bachelors are unhappy would be like that. That's not something you can know to be true or false just on the basis of the meanings of the words. The same thing is true of a soul is an immaterial object that will return to God after your death. That's something that could be true, could be false. It's not something you can figure out on the basis of the meanings of the terms alone. So, when I say something about knowledge of the world, I mean these synthetic propositions or these synthetic judgments. That's what's at stake. Nobody disagrees, really, that we can know some things independently of experience just by knowing the language, just by understanding the meanings of the terms. So what's really at stake is our knowledge, not just of language, but of the world, these synthetic judgments or propositions. Are there any of those we can know independently of experience? We've looked at another distinction. This is one also from Avicenna. the distinction between a posteriori judgments and a priori judgments. Certain things we can know a priori, says Avicenna, namely, things that we can understand and know about the world that are independent of experience. Other things rely on experience. I can't know anything really about chairs. Well, can I know anything about chairs? I should ask, independently of experience. Well, analytic things, I can know that chairs are chairs. But is there anything else I can know? Well, that gets us into the question of what the definition of a chair is, and as we've seen, that's surprisingly hard. But let's leave that aside. We're interested in knowledge of the world, knowledge about chairs, not just things that we can derive from knowing the meaning of the word chair. And you would think, I don't think I know anything about that, independently of experience. Yeah.
I mean, the chair was invented because someone at one point got really tired of standing and wanted to sit and not on the ground. So, in a way, like, if you see a chair and you know nothing about the world, you're going to think, my legs are tired. Let me try sitting on this.
She says, look, here, who invented the chair? That person's name, presumably lost time. Yes?
Perhaps, I'm assuming that in the early days of mankind, people would sit on rocks, or they would sit on, I don't know, I'm not sure if there's anything soft to sit on. And I guess maybe they sort of started seeing rocks that were more shaped, and the better shaped rocks were more comfortable, and then the idea of the chair formed from that.
Oh, okay, good. The cavemen, got tired of sitting on rocks, sitting on the ground, searching for a soft patch of grass in which to sit. They were tired. They had been out clubbing saber-toothed tigers all day. My image of this is basically from the Flintstones. But many of it, whatever they were doing all day, they were tired, they wanted to sit down. So somebody in the midst of time invents a chair. So what about that proposition? Chairs are meant for sitting. Is that something we can know independently of experience? Yeah.
Not necessarily, because like a toddler or a child, like if they see a chair, like constantly, you hear stories of people telling them like, don't climb on it, or don't mess around with the chair. Like if you don't know the purpose, like you're not going to do what it's intended for.
Oh, good. Yeah, most things that have a purpose, it's not like you can figure out their purpose automatically. And you're right, actually, we tell children, don't climb up on that chair. Right? You might think, and suppose you never sat in a chair at home because you didn't want your child to learn that chairs were for sitting. And so it's like, all right, you can come in, but don't sit on a chair because we don't want Johnny to think. We're doing an experiment. We want to find out whether Johnny can figure out that chairs are for sitting without ever experiencing somebody sitting on a chair. So we got to guard his person. The parents of the Buddha tried to prevent him from having any unpleasant experiences. This parent decides, gotta prevent people from having experience of people sitting on chairs. Well, anyway, would the kids ever figure it out? I don't know. I mean, if you took a cell phone and dropped it in the middle of some, tribe in the Amazon that had never had contact with other people before, would they figure out what it was for? I mean, I doubt it.
If it doesn't have a lock code.
Maybe. I mean, even without going through the lock, they can poke this, and there are all sorts of notifications. Oh, many people are submitting papers on something called Canvas. As I speak. Either they're not here, or some of you are writing your papers right now. That's amazing. Anyway, I think it's not clear to me. Anyway, the idea of intent and function and experience, that's something that it's hard to predict. It depends on how remote that experience is and so on, maybe, but it's hard for me to imagine that people would figure out the function of most things just on the basis of observing them without seeing people using them in that way. Yeah?
So in the sort of debate between rationalism and empiricism, is evolutionary science used, and which side tends to use it more? I mean, is it
Good
thought
question.
of, empirically, is it thought of as experience that ancestors have used that has been passed down sort of chemically or genetically, or is it used as, this is innate knowledge, you just know this because you're born, because humans have existed together?
All right, you're raising a very interesting question. Rationalists often view evolution as their enemy, but I've never understood why, because it's actually an ideal friend for the rationalist. Because, after all, to the extent that the rationalist has to appeal to God's existence and God stamping the mind with the same stamp that is stamped on the world and so on, you might think, look, it's a kind of philosophical explanation, but it's one that has very heavy religious commitments. It's something that a lot of people are going to reject out of hand. Whereas an evolutionary explanation of this can say, well, here's how it can happen that our brains actually have all these innate capacities. Maybe some of our ancestors did not have them. They did not survive. They did not reproduce. And so the ones that were lucky enough to have these innate capacities are the ones that, in fact, thrived and were able to do this. So you could give an evolutionary explanation. That's one way in which it could be a friend of the rationalist. Another way, and this complicates the issue considerably, increasingly people come to see experience as something that does interact with our DNA in various ways. And if that's true, it might be that actually there are experiences of your ancestors that are passed down in certain respects. So what was, you might say, something gained through experience for them becomes something we have independently of experience. Not, at least independently of our own experience, maybe not independently of human experience as a whole. And so you're right, there's a really fascinating question there that we could go into in much greater depth about the connection. But I agree with you, there's a huge connection. And it's highly relevant to thinking about these issues, to think about the effects of evolution and the ways in which our genetic heritage and our environmental heritage, you might say, connect. It's much more complicated than people for a long time thought. In any case, we've described the same distinction in various ways, but I want to get finally to the key question, which is that the judgment rationalist thinks there are synthetic a priori truths. Synthetic because they really are truths about the world, but a priori in the sense that we can know them independently of experience. So they might be part of our genetic heritage, for example. It might be there's an evolutionary story about why we have these innate cognitive capacities. But there is something that just through reason alone, through reflection alone, independently of our own experience, we can know that is really knowledge about the world itself, not just knowledge of language. Well, I'm going to show you this in a little picture. So don't worry if you haven't written everything here down. You will get it here. First, to Leibniz. There's a question whether the soul in itself is entirely empty, like a writing tablet on which nothing has yet been written, a tabula rasa. Often people use that phrase, referring to empiricism, or John Locke's theory in particular. That phrase never appears in Locke, but it does appear in Leibniz, who is here criticizing Locke. That's the opinion of Aristotle and the author of the essay, namely John Locke. And whether everything that's inscribed upon it comes solely from the senses and experience, as Aristotle and Locke think, or whether the soul originally contains the principles of several notions and doctrines, which are merely roused on certain occasions by external objects, as I hold, along with Plato and even with the schoolmen, that is to say, with various medieval philosophers. Hence, there arises another question, whether all truths are dependent on experience, that is to say, on induction and instances, or whether there are some which have yet another foundation. So here's the way I can draw a little picture of this. There's the distinction between analytic judgments and synthetic judgments, and also the distinction between a priori judgments and a posteriori judgments. Everyone pretty much agrees that some things are analytic and a priori, like bachelors are unmarried, or a soul is a soul. Everybody pretty much agrees that some things are synthetic and a posteriori, like some chairs are black. Nobody thinks they're really analytic a posteriori things, because we just, for analytic judgments, need experience learning language. We don't really need to learn about the world independently. Or at least that's the way most people have thought about it. I'm going to otherwise ignore that question. The really historically important question is whether there are synthetic a priori judgments. Things that are a priori, independent of experience, but nevertheless synthetic, really about the world and not just about language. Well, the empiricist says, no, there are no such things. Okay, so that question mark becomes a denial. No, there are no synthetic a priori judgments. But the rationalist says, yes, there are. There are some things we can know about the world independently of experience. Now, what would some of those things be? What could we know independently of experience? Yeah.
Danger, I think.
Ooh, what about danger?
I don't think people jump into a dark pit for experience just to see what will happen. I think
yes. Would anybody jump into a dark pit just to see what happens? or go to Fright Night at Six Flags, or go to a haunted house. Well, some people do. Presumably they know something about what will happen. I have to remove the chair because now I'm going to talk about another experiment. Suppose you put a baby up on the table here and set it free and said, let's see if it falls off the edge. Would the baby go right off the edge, or would it stop at the edge?
How old is the baby?
How old is the baby, she asks. You might say, has the baby fallen off things before? Has it learned from experience things have edges? People have done that experiment, kind of a cruel experiment, but, but anyway, yeah, you can find out. So at a certain point, the baby stops without having fallen, but you might think at an earlier stage, the baby, doesn't stop. One of my daughters rolled right off the bed at one point. Here, yes, I will put the baby on the bed while I get dressed. Then baby goes, woo, and baby had never rolled over before. Learns to roll over, it rolls right off the bed. Great parenting skills of my She later went to UT. I don't know whether that's a sign she was okay after that or not. But anyway, it worked out sort of okay. Anyhow, the idea is, you might think, yeah, is danger something we are aware of innately? Or is it something we have to learn? Are pleasure and pain things that are innate, as Leibniz thinks? Or do we have to learn about pleasure and pain from the world? Yeah?
There's one innate thing that I think all human babies have. I don't know the exact name of it. I think it's something like the moral reflex or something like that. But if you hold a baby in a certain way, it goes like this, like trying to grab.
Yeah. Oh, that's some sign of this, right? You hold the baby in a certain way and it tries to grab onto something. It does this automatically. It's not like, yeah, I've learned that when the doctor holds you this way, you better start reaching out for something because bad things are about to happen. No, the baby does that sort of reflexively. And lots of things are reflexes. You might think that's not really conceptual, but some of them do seem to be conceptual. They seem to indicate the baby has a concept of what it is to be right side up, or what constitutes danger, or something like that. Yeah?
But there has been, somebody said, that babies in the womb, did they learn that kind of stuff? So even when they're in the womb, they're still learning, they hear things and everything, so it's not necessarily just innate knowledge.
Actually, that's a really good point. We're talking about certain things being there already at birth, but the baby is having experiences in the womb. Perhaps you've heard of mothers who want to make their babies more intelligent, and so listen to Mozart and put their bellies near the speaker to make sure the child is listening to Mozart and becoming, smarter in the womb. So yeah, there are experiences that the baby has before actual birth. Now, let me, in a moment, we'll get there. I really want to get to Avicenna's way of thinking about this. He has an example called the flying man. He asks, suppose you took someone, had them in suspended animation, essentially, flying through the air without any resistance, or in a sensory deprivation tank, so they got no information from the senses at all. Is there anything they could think? That is to say, would they have any concepts that were coming to them innately, that weren't coming from experience? Would they know anything? Okay. Well, are there things that the flying man could know independently of experience, even in a sensory deprivation tank from birth? Avicenna says yes. He could have the concept of himself. He could know that he exists. So another instance of that I am being latched onto by a rationalist is something that would be innate knowledge. Yes?
Would we need the knowledge of a certain language to be able to mentally interpret the concept of I am? Or would he just have a general, unexplainable sense of being?
Ooh, good. There's another key question. To what extent would this knowledge be dependent on having a language? After all, if you didn't have a language, having no sensory input, then would you be able to have any knowledge at all? Could you have any concepts? You wouldn't be able to articulate them, but would you have concepts without those labels attached, you might think, within the head? This, too, is something that is a real area of research and disagreement. And so some people would say, no, thought is something that follows language. Without language, you couldn't really have concepts or thoughts or knowledge. But others say, no. Thought is something that is prior to language. And so actually you could have a thought even without having any words to express that thought with. So that too is something that's both a philosophical and a psychological question that people still debate. Here are some things that Avicenna also thinks you could know innately, that are synthetic a priori truths. The whole is greater than its parts. Things equal to the same thing are equal to one another. Descartes not only thinks the I think and the I am are synthetic a priori, but also that anybody who thinks has to exist while they think, that nothing is made from nothing, that it's impossible for anything to be and not be at the same time, that what's been done can't be undone. Now those are things that are interesting, because the claim here is we couldn't learn those things from experience. Could you learn that you cannot change the past, that what's been done cannot be undone? It's something that, in a sense, isn't just a linguistic truth either. It's not just knowing the meanings of terms. There's something about the irreversibility of time, you might say, really is built into the structure of our minds from the beginning. It's not something we learn through experience by trying to build time machines and finding out it's really hard. It's not something that is just a linguistic truth. It's a deep truth about the world that our minds are built already understanding. Leibniz has this principle of sufficient reason. There can be no fact without a sufficient reason why it's so and not otherwise. In other words, everything has a reason for being that way. Everything has a cause. Kant puts it, every event has a cause. Kant also thinks that arithmetic is like this. 7 plus 5 equals 12. And other mathematical truths are things that he takes to be synthetic and a priori. Between any 2 points lies one and only one line, a geometrical truth, Kant would say, is synthetic and a priori. So all of these things from mathematics, things that are basic principles about physics, every event having a cause and things like that, would be candidates. In medieval philosophy, there's much more. God exists. The soul is immortal. The world consists of substances and their attributes. Every substance has an essence. You ought to seek the good. Happiness is good. Courage is a virtue, and so on. Now, Leibniz gives us an argument. He says some events can be foreseen before we have any trial of them. It's manifest we contribute something of our own. And here's the underlying argument. We always have experience of particular things, and yet we believe we know some universal, general truth. How is that possible? The universality is not coming from experience. I see things fall when I drop them. Here are particular instances of that. Okay, what goes up must come down. Drop, fall. We have lots of experiences of that. But we don't just think, yeah, a lot of times when you drop things, they fall down. We think that there is really a universal truth, that as long as something is heavier than air, when you release it, it's going to fall. Why do we assert that as a universal truth? And not just as lots of times that happens. The idea is this. Everything that is an experience of something particular. So knowledge immediately justified by that is knowledge of particular things. Universal truths don't follow from their particular instances. So experience couldn't justify universal truths. That's coming from something else. No matter how many instances we have, I release it, it falls. I release it, it falls. That wouldn't be enough to justify the claim that it will always fall when I release it. And there's something similar about necessity. Let me skip ahead to that one. What we experience is always a contingent truth. It's something that might have gone that way, but also could have gone otherwise. And yet we think we can know certain things happen of necessity. Not just that, what a weird accident that it keeps falling. We think it must fall, that it's a law-like thing that it falls. And what gives us that law-like character? That's not something we experience. That's something that is being supplied by an a priori component. So, Leibniz says experience can't justify necessary truths. We'd never have any universal or necessary knowledge if we had to get all of our knowledge from experience. Everything contingent can't give us a substantive universal conclusion. And the same thing finally is true of our causal judgments. We just see one thing happen, then another. We could never get a causal conclusion.